This is the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And Halenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Halenda's, the way sausage should taste. And now, here's Ted.
Well, thanks very much for joining us. It's a pleasure having you listen in on our podcast. And if you're a first-time listener, welcome. And if you're back for second, third helpings, we really appreciate that. Pass the word along and enjoy. You know, I got some bad news for you right off the top, because just as you thought money was tight, if you're a beer drinker, get this, okay? The government, the federal government, have plans in the works, my friends, to increase the federal tax on beer by 6.3% effective April the 1st, 6.3%. That, in fact, is the biggest increase in 40 years. So the folks, you can imagine, at Beer Canada are not happy about this, because they're going to take the blame for this, that it's not their fault, and decided they needed to do something about it. And what did they do about it? This.
On April the 1st, Ottawa plans to raise the tax on beer by another 6%. What do Canadians think?
We don't like it, eh? Good day, I'm Bob Mackenzie. This is my brother Doug.
How's it going, eh?
Okay, everything else in Canada is frozen, eh? Freeze the beer tax, too.
Come on, MPs. You's elected to serve, so serve the beer.
And hold the tax, eh?
A message from Beer Canada. Stop the hike. Visit hereforbeer.ca.
We approve this message, eh?
Well, I don't approve of you.
Take off.
That, of course, is Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas, better known as the Mackenzie brothers. And what a brilliant idea by the folks of Beer Canada. The creative comes from Scott Feschuk of Feschuk Reed, and creative director and veteran comedy writer Larry MacInnis. And he joins me right now. How did this all come about, Larry? This is a fascinating project and a brilliant stroke on part of Beer Canada, I think.
Well, Rick Moranis and I are great friends. Dave and I are friends as well. I got a call from Rick a couple of weeks ago. Rick said Beer Canada had approached he and Dave to bring back the Mackenzie brothers, and fantastic idea. And he said they already have a great writer involved, Scott Feschuk of Feschuk Reed. He said, I'd like you to get involved too, help us write some jokes. And then because we're going to be in LA and New York recording our parts, we'd like you to direct in the studio and then work with an engineer to put the commercials together. So it was fantastic. Rick and I go way back. We can talk about that later probably, but we go way back to 1976 when I first met him when he was working at Chum FM.
Yeah, no, let's talk about that now so people get an idea of how close you are and how long you've known each other, that it wasn't just a phone call out of nowhere, because you and Rick worked together for the Chum radio people.
Well, yeah, I was working at, I started at Chum FM and Chum Radio and Chum FM in 1973. In 1976, I got the itch to go to an advertising agency. My boss got hired as creative director at an ad agency. On his first day on the job, he called me and offered me a job. And of course, I took it because I just wanted to find out what the agency business was like. I want to do TV ads and print ads and all that stuff. So I went to the agency, and within 2 days, I realized I hated the advertising agency business because it wasn't radio, and especially it wasn't Chum, which was a very special place.
That's a Toronto radio station, by the way. For those people who are listening outside of Toronto, Chum is a huge name in Toronto. So please go ahead.
So it was fantastic. I had spent 3 wonderful years at Chum, and they treated me wonderfully. But I left and I went to the ad agency, and during that summer, I left in May, and during that summer, I turned on the radio one afternoon, and there's this guy on the radio, the new guy doing afternoon drive on Chum FM. And I could tell, even though he wasn't doing jokes, I could tell that he was funny. Ted, you do stand-up, that rhythm is so important. You can just tell. So I called Duff Roman, who was the program director of Chum FM then, and I said, Duff,
right.
I said, who's the new guy on Chum FM? He said, that's a guy, Rick Moranis. I said, is he a stand-up comic? He said, yeah, he does stand up. I said, why is he telling jokes? He said, no. I can just tell by his rhythm. So I was a fan before I ever met him. And then 5 months later, Chum called me and asked me to go back. So I went back, and of course, Rick and I met each other, I think maybe in the hallway or in the copy department or in the jock lounge or somewhere. And immediately we became friends. We became friends because I wanted to exploit his talents. He could do voices. He was funny. He was a great announcer. And so we did a lot of work together on various accounts, including a real famous one, Al Palladini's Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury, which maybe we'll get into a little later on as well. And then so Rick went his way when he went SCTV, and he left the Chum, I think probably in 1980, got into SCTV, got into making movies and everything. And we've remained friends ever since. We're only 3 months difference. He's 3 months older than I am, and I kid him about that all the time. We're very close. We have the same cultural reference points. We really like each other. He's a really good friend. He's been a good friend, even though we live far apart. We're in touch regularly. And so when he called me, it wasn't unexpected that he would call me. He calls me sometimes. But it was great news that they were bringing back the Mackenzie brothers, because I think there's a big soft spot in Canadians' hearts for those characters because of their innocence and their likability. And because, Rick and Dave, you couldn't meet two nicer guys who were completely unaffected by celebrity. They haven't changed at all in all the time I've known them. So it was great to get that call, and really fun to work on the project.
And the interesting thing is that the Mackenzie brothers were born out of necessity, because from what I understand, the producers came to them, or the network, I guess, came to them and said, we need a little bit more Canadian content. You got to do something with some Canadian feel to it. And they thought, well, what's more Canadian than a couple of guys sitting around drinking beer and, in plaid shirts and just talking hockey and talking goofing. And so it was really more as a filler, from what I understand.
Yes, NBC. Remember the SCTV ran on NBC and CBC, I believe.
Right.
And so the CBC, the portion that was to run on CBC, they needed 2.5 minutes or so because they had more programming time available. And any Canadian content will work. But the characters took off so quickly. And of course, they had the hit album and the hit single with Getty. And so they became, it always ran in the NBC SCTV version as well.
So when they pitched the idea, when Beer Canada pitched the idea to Rick and to Dave, how eager were they to do this, or maybe how hesitant were they to try to reach back 30 years?
Well, I don't know about that. I know that when they called me, it was quite soon after they had been approached by Beer Canada. So they had decided pretty quickly, I think, to do it. And Rick explained the whole situation to me, that I think it was 2017, the Canadian government put in what is known as an escalator tax, that on April 1st of every year going forward in perpetuity, that the cost of alcohol, not just beer, but alcohol in Canada, would go up by the rate of inflation. And that was really negligible right up until this year, right? So it was either flat or negligible up to now, but now it's like 6.3%. And the breweries believe that is going to be a tough pill for people to swallow. And they want it to be known that it's not their fault, probably. And they also want to see if they can get it stopped. But they're very smart. Corinne Cousineau is and CJ Ali are the people who are working with Beer Canada on this. They're very smart. They know that you can't get on the air. And I know this from my marketing background. You can't get on the air and browbeat people into seeing your point of view. So I think the idea to use humor and to use beloved characters and to have a message that's kind of like gentle poking fun at the tax is the way to go.
Yeah. And again, I think that, as you mentioned, they're doing this almost for defensive purposes, because they know that the average consumer is going to go into the beer store on April the 1st and think it's either an April 1st joke or they're going to flip out and start yelling at the poor person behind the cash register, blame Beer Canada or blame Molson or Labatt or whomever it is. And they're on the defensive saying, hey, it's not us, it's the government that's taking this money. We're not making anything from this.
Exactly. And I think it's a good move on their part.
I think you're right. I don't know how effective it's going to be in terms of convincing this particular government to change their mind. Whether I don't think that they'll eliminate the 6.3% interest or increase, I should say, but maybe they'll drop it a couple of points.
Maybe they will.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah, maybe they will drop it. And the other thing, Ted, is that the commercials just were running a day or 2 days before they got tremendous reaction in newspapers and in other media and Twitter and all social media things. The commercials are being really noticed and really talked about already, and I think the awareness is going to help. And maybe people, their website, by the way, hereforbeer.ca is a fantastic website. It's clean, it's easy to navigate, it's funny, it has cartoon images of Bob and Doug on it. And they're just asking Canadians who care about these things to go on the website and maybe make their voices heard. And I think the way they're handling it with humor and with kind of gentle poking fun, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah. And so take me through that whole process of being in a studio. And I take it that Rick and Dave were in different locations in the United States than where you and Scott were, right?
Sure. So we use Wanted Sound and Picture in Toronto. They're fantastic recording studios. I use them for a lot of my recording I do with my clients. So they hopped on board right away. Rick was in New York, where he lives, and Dave was in Los Angeles, where he lives. And Dave was on a Zoom call, and Rick was on his phone. And we, like I said, we probably had 40, 50 jokes. We had a script sketched out. Scott and I and Dave and Rick had prepared scripts, but we did improv as well. And they improv'd a whole bunch of stuff in the session, much of it that get into the finished commercials. And so when they left, it was left to this great engineer, Brian, at Wanted Sound and Picture, to kind of, we always felt that the sound issue of Dave being on a Zoom call and Rick being on a phone wouldn't matter with these characters, because there's a homemade likability quality to them anyway. So that was never a problem really conceptually, but we wanted to make the sound as good as possible. I think Wanted did a great job as that. And we hired Tom Park, who's a guy, a really talented voiceover guy who I've hired on other projects. Tom is the big voice announcer that you hear on them. He did a fantastic job. So it took about maybe 3 or 4 hours in the studio after they left, because we had a rough outline of scripts, and then we were mixing and matching from the improv. And you know yourself, Ted, when you're putting commercials together, you have to get it exactly to time. And so sometimes the funniest stuff doesn't win, because the stuff that's funny but maybe not the funniest is better advertising. And so you're always making choices, and that's what I do. That's what Rick and Dave trusted me to do at the end of the day, is to make those choices. And of course, we had Corinne and CJ in the studio with me, and it's always great to have the client there, because they have great input as well, and these are really nice, smart clients who I would work with in a heartbeat again. They're fantastic. So it was a really fun experience, and the commercials, as I said, the commercials are really kind of getting a really positive reaction. But my feeling is, this is just my opinion, but it probably doesn't matter, no matter how funny or not funny they really are, the commercials. I think that the longing to have Bob and Doug back in our lives as Canadians, after all of the stuff we've been through, not just in the last 3 years, but the 20 or so years that Bob and Doug have not been with us, I think there's a longing in Canadians' hearts for those characters and that kind of innocence and that naivete and good humor. And it's all good humor. I didn't know until this, I've known Rick all these years, and I was a big fan of Bob and Doug. And every Christmas I would, the 12 Beers of Christmas is a staple in my home. Right? Yeah. But I didn't know that the Kuruku Kuku Kuku is based on the Hinterland Who's Who vignettes that used to run in Canada, that are among my favorite little short film pieces ever. I didn't realize that until I was producing these sessions. I realized that that's what it is, and a lot of people were commenting on that on Twitter. And that's a funny thing with Dave and Rick. They're so funny. I'll tell you just quickly one. Maybe you'll play this spot after we did the spots. We got the stuff that we had scripted down, and I said we went to improv. They said, well, let's do some improv. I said, so I think Rick said, so Rick immediately launches into, let's attack some other things other than beer then.
Good day, I'm Bob Mackenzie. This is my brother Doug.
How's it going, eh?
Why don't you attack some other stuff, eh?
Like yams, confetti, or liver, eh? I hate liver.
Leave beer alone, eh?
Yeah.
The kind of mind that puts those three things together, ranks them in order, which is perfect ranking. It's perfect rhythm-wise. It's perfect. It's perfect in every way. You could sit in a room with 15 writers and never come up with that. And so it's working with those guys who are such great guys and such talented performers and so generous, so generous with their time and with really kind to everybody. I've never seen. I wrote the Junos with Rick both times that he hosted the Junos, and I've never seen him have an uncool moment with anybody. He's just a wonderful guy.
Larry MacInnis is with me. He's part of the creative team. He, along with Scott Festrick of Festrick Reed, put together this magnificent campaign for Beer Canada. It's really just a warning. It's a warning and an apology mixed into one, I think, Larry. The warning for people is, hey, as of April 1st, the cost of beer is going to go up, and we apologize, and it's also, it's not our fault. This is a government thing. So they're covering their three different kind of bases, and at the same time entertaining people, which is a great thing. Now, in any recording session, and you've done 10,000 times more than I have, there's always stuff left on the floor for numerous reasons. You just don't have time to put it all in there, and some of it might be a little bit off color. You gotta have some great stuff lying around that you just can't put anywhere, even on Twitter.
Well, the very first joke I wrote for the commercials never made it in because it's not kind of them. But Dave comes on, and the announcer introduces them, and Dave goes, "Karuku, kuku, kuku, kuku," and Rick goes, "Hi, how's it going?" And Dave goes, "I'm talking to my member." And Rick goes, "Oh, I talked to my member too. What are you saying?" He says, "Oh, hey, Mr. Member of Parliament or Miss Member of Parliament, it's tough to bear text." So that didn't go. I always like I'm talking to my member. And the other one that I kept pitching every time. Every time we spoke, I wrote it initially as a tagline for one of the commercials. The tagline is after Tom comes on at the back end and does the hereforbeer.ca, they come back with kind of like a quick line out. And there's taglines in all of the spots. But the one I pitched that never got in was Rick says, "We could go on a hunger strike." And Dave says, "Liquids only, eh?" So I love that. I'm glad finally I'm allowed to say it publicly. So there's all kinds. Scott had some great lines too. Scott did a lot of work on the announcer parts and did a lot of heavy lifting on. He's doing a lot of work on the social media. So it was really a great 4-person kind of intensive writing material. Like I said, and at the end of the day, you will forego something that's funny if there's something else that's funny, but is also better advertising. So if you listen to the messages very carefully, you'll notice that every line is really pointing in the direction of the message we want to get across, which of course is what you want to do in all advertising.
Yeah, and there's a great line in one of there are 3 commercials in total, right?
Right, yeah.
And one of them is, "We drink responsibly, now you tax responsibly."
Yeah, I think that was Dave's line. That's a great line. And that was we always knew that line was going to be in there because it's the drink responsibly, of course, you want to say it anyway. Yep. But I think the tax responsibly and the way Dave says responsibly is just funny. It's like, I don't know. I know you did stand up, Ted, you're very funny. And you know that sometimes words on paper, this is why it's so difficult sometimes to sell comedy to clients if they're just reading a script. But you have to know that you're working with performers who can just put a tweak on an inflection or a way they pronounce something. Just the way Dave says responsibly in that is funny to me. Just funny.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
Hi, it's Ted Woloshyn for Tom's Place, where the month of February is all about hearts and family. Tom's late father, William Mahalik, was born on February 20th, 1916. He founded the original store back in 1958, believing in the importance of caring for your customers and always working hard to give the customer the best deal. These strong values carry on today at Tom's Place, and in honor of his father and the family business he created, Tom is celebrating with a Family Day sale. Selected 100% wool suits that retail for up to $5.99, now starting at just $179. Lips and dress shirts on final clearance. Winter coats, 50% off, and beautiful cashmere sweaters, regularly $500, now only $99. And they're available in men's and women's styles. It's all about family at Tom's Place. And at Tom's Place, everyone is treated like part of the family. The Tom's Place Family Day Sale, all month long in the heart of Kensington Market. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866 309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Wallachin.
Let's go back and talk about, because you had mentioned that you worked on a campaign with Rick back when you were both working together at Chum for Al Palladini, who ended up being a Minister of Transportation in the Mike Harris provincial government here in the province of Ontario. Ran a very successful Lincoln Mercury dealership called Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury out in Vaughan, which is the city above Toronto, which we'll get to that in a minute as well. The concept for this came directly from you.
At Al Palladini's Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury, you can lease all makes and models.
Don't tell my wife about the models part.
Al Palladini has become a household word.
Uh-oh, we better call a plumber. I think I plugged up the Al Palladini.
And in the words of Al Palladini's mother,
Al Palladini's Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury is the best Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury ever owned by a son of mine, who I still call Albert. I don't care what he says.
Visit Al Palladini's Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury at Weston Road and Highway 7, because any Palladini is a pal of mine.
I was working late one afternoon, and a sales rep, Billy Cross, came into my office at Chum and said, I want to pitch a car dealer. It wasn't even Vaughan then, in Woodbridge, he said, because I don't think Vaughan existed then. He said, in Woodbridge, and would you put something together? I said, well, Bill, I'm leaving town. In those days, Chum was putting together something called the Video History of Rock, which we took out eventually for 2 or 3 years to every high school in Southern Ontario. And Roger Ashby and I and Bob McMillan would go to Barrie, CKVR in Barrie, which is the Chum-owned TV station at that time. They would sign off at 1 a.m. and we would go in on Tuesday overnight and Wednesday overnight and work on that film. In those days, you just literally had to work on film to do it. And it took us 14 months to put it together. So I was waiting. I said to Bill, look, Roger's coming to pick me up at the station around 10:30. We're going to drive to Barrie. It's like 4 o'clock now. I'll see what I can do. So about 6 o'clock, I took the information that Bill gave me and I called Directory Assistance. I said, can I have the number for Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury? And she gave me a number and I called. And the person who picked up the phone says, good evening, Pineview Pontiac Buick. It turns out that Pine Tree Lincoln Mercury was on one side of the street and Pineview Pontiac Buick was on the other side of the street. And even the Directory Assistance operator was confused by it. So I realized, okay, I'm going to have to do something to differentiate them. So I looked down
Highway 7.
Yeah, Western Road and Highway 7. So I looked down the information sheet that Bill had given me, and at the bottom it said, contact Al Palladini. I swear to God, Ted, as soon as I heard Al Palladini in my head, the words, any Palladini is a pal of mine, fell from the sky like angel dust. And so, problem solved. I knew I was going to make anybody whose name can sound that adorable in that phrase. Any Palladini is a pal of mine. I'm going to make it all about Al Palladini. And so I now immediately thought of Rick. I've said, and the conceit will be that we'll have somebody obviously endorsing Al Palladini who's not these real people. So we'll do cartoon versions of his mother and his uncle and his wife and his daughter and his son. And Rick will be the announcer as well. And Rick loved the idea. And we produced the demo. And I sent that out with the Bill the next week. And Bill came back and said he doesn't want to do it. I don't know why he doesn't want to do it. Rick and I were, and Zeke Stebiak, who produced the demo, we were heartbroken because we loved the idea. So, okay, it's done. What are you going to do? So 9 months later, a new salesperson started at Chum, a guy named Doug Thorne. And I didn't tell Doug that those spots had already been taken out to Al. So I gave him another cassette of the spots. And I sent him out. And he comes back the next day and he says two things. One, He's still not going to go with it. And 2, stop sending guys out with it. So 5 years go by. By this time, 5 years. By this time, Rick is like making movies. He's a major star. And one day the phone rings in my office, and it's a guy named Vince Gianblocco. He's the owns Communicat Advertising. And he says, did you write commercials years ago for Pine Tree Liquor Mercury? I said, yeah. I said, they never aired. He said, well, let me tell you what happened. He said, I was sitting in Al Palladini's office last night with my creative director, and we were trying to convince him to go mainstream with radio because he had been doing his ads in the Italian language radio station, and we were doing his Italian language print ads. But we want to do mainstream because we think there's real potential there. And my creative director said, Al, have you ever done any radio ads before? And he said, no, but he said, there's this kid at Chum who was sending guys out with these commercials for me. And he said, I like them. And he said, everybody here likes them. He said, but my wife hated them. And she said they were making fun of my family. They said, okay, well, can you put them on? And so the way the story was told to me was the creative director's looking at the ceiling as the ad is playing. And when they're over, he says, Al, please tell me you haven't been sitting on these ads for 5 years. Al said, yeah. He said, my wife hated them. Al and I used to joke about this later. He divorced his wife and he kept me, which is a whole other story. But so he immediately agreed to try the ads. And within 6 months, he went from the 11th biggest car dealer in Southern Ontario to the second biggest car dealer in Southern Ontario. And it was only because he had changed his radio advertising. He went out and spent $100,000 on a new sign that said, big light neon sign that said Al Palladini's Pine Tree Liquor Mercury. He rebranded his dealership completely, and he became a folk hero. When he was sworn in as Minister of Transportation in the Mike Harris government, when he stepped up, put his hand on the Bible, Mike Harris said, any Palladini is a pal of mine. It just kind of became one of those things. We did about 50 ads. Rick would, no matter where Rick was in the world, when we were doing, it was time to do new ads, Al would fly him back to Toronto, which Rick loved, and he would come to the station. It would be like a family reunion. Everybody loved Rick. Everybody would kind of became a festive event. We would record the commercials and we would go to dinner, and he would fly back to wherever he was, whether he was in England doing Little Shop of Horrors or in LA working on a movie or wherever he was. And so, and through all of that, of course, I got to write the Junos with Rick in 90 and 92. And it was just one of those cultural things, right? It just kind of took off.
And Al Palladini, who unfortunately passed away at too young an age many years ago, really the name and the concept of Palladini, because if you ever met Al Palladini, he was like a pal. He was a gregarious, outgoing, jovial kind of guy.
Exactly. His vanity license plate before we ever started the campaign was Al Pal, right? Yeah. He was a perfect match for the character we were portraying, and he was very, very smart. I remember him saying to me, he was sitting down, he was trying to figure out, why do these work so well? Besides the obvious fact that Rick was so fantastic on them. And he realized that he said to me one day, he said, Larry, I just realized that you don't have to sell cars. And in fact, Rick, Ted, we never mentioned a price or a model other than the model when we mentioned in Pine Tree Liquor Mercury. We never mentioned a price, a sale, a model, service, any of that. They always ended the same way. Visit Al Palladini's Pine Tree Liquor Mercury at Western Road and Highway 7, because any Palladini is a pal of mine. And Al said to me, the genius, I think, Larry, that you probably didn't even realize when you're writing them is that you don't have to sell cars. I sell cars. I'm very good at selling cars. What you have to do is sell me. And if they can like me before they meet me, I'm halfway to selling them a car. And that's so true. And so that's a lesson I've taken with many, many of my clients since, that like if you can sell, because people are looking for happiness, and we like to do business with people we like, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're always trying to build a relationship with you're trying to have your business have a relationship with listeners, so that when the time comes, maybe not this month, maybe not this year, maybe 2 years from now, maybe it'll be 6 years before you buy that engagement ring. But when the time comes to buy that ring, they will think of you first, and they will think of you fondly, and they will think that you're an honest, trustworthy, nice person. And that's partly, of course, the reason why I think the Bob and Doug stuff for Beer Canada has worked.
Well, you're a good friend. Larry MacInnis is my guest. You're a good friend with Terry O'Reilly, who hosts on CBC Radio a wonderful program, which is also available in podcast form, called Under the Influence. He wrote a book a number of years ago called This I Know, where he talks about how advertising for products, you're not necessarily selling the product, you're selling what the product represents. It's like when you're selling beer, you're selling a lifestyle. You're not selling the beer. You're not talking about what kind of hops go in there and what the temperature of the water is and how long it sits around. You're selling the whole picture of people sitting around at a barbecue and with beach balls and having a great time. And that's what you're talking about here with Palladini.
You're not selling the feature, you're selling the benefit. When I taught copywriting at Humber and Seneca colleges, I used to explain it to my students this way. I'd say the feature is that it's a can of paint, it's pink, it's this price, and it's this size. The benefit is the look on your 8-year-old daughter's face when she's showing off her new bedroom to her girlfriends. That's what you're selling. You're always selling happiness in one form or another. And so I'm always trying to find a way, how can I denote happiness in this product in some way, or making life easier, or taking stress off, or showing that you and the product, or you and the advertiser are simpatico in some way. And that really goes a long way, I think. You're selling benefits, not features. And it took me, they hired me at Chum as a kid. I got the call to work at Chum on my 20th birthday. 2 weeks later, I was in Toronto, and they hired me because I had talent, but I had absolutely no skills. But for Chum, that was fantastic because they could form me into this kind of Chum person, and learn. And I'm constantly learning. I have, if you look around my office here, it's filled with books and things on marketing and advertising and broadcasting. I'm constantly hungry to learn, and it took me a while to learn the benefit feature thing, but it's a really, really important thing to know.
So let's fast forward several years from the Palladini campaign, and suddenly you're called upon to promote a city called Vaughan, which is located north of the city of Toronto. Take me through that story.
Well, Vaughan was, this is 92, I think. Vaughan was an amalgamation of several smaller communities north of Toronto, Woodbridge, Maple,
yep.
Kleinburg, places like that. And I get a call from a producer friend of mine named Greg Johnson. Fantastic. Greg, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but a fantastic producer. And I did many, many things with Greg. And he called me and he said, I want to pitch the city of Vaughan. He said, you've been recommended as the writer. I said, who? What happened? He said, well, Al Palladini is good friends with the mayor, Lorna Jackson. And he went to her. He's on the board of trade or whatever it is. He said, you should get the guy who does my spots to launch the city. And so they want you to do it. I said, oh, fantastic. So Greg and I went out to Vaughan, and it's like, in those days, it seemed like forever to get there. But we get there. And
I grew up there.
Yeah. Did a meeting. I got a meeting with Mayor Jackson and her assistant and her marketing person and several other people, and Greg and I. And for 2 hours, I did with her what I always do, which is I find out as much as I can about what they want the message to be. Like, what's the takeaway for the listener? And tell me all the things that can make that happen. And so they were fantastic. Lorna Jackson was extremely smart and very nice. Mm-hmm. And I went away and I wrote what I thought they wanted, which I don't have that ad anymore, but I think it must have been a pretty good ad, or I never would have presented it. But I went up on myself to present it about maybe 3 weeks later, and I explain why I'm doing what I'm doing and all the stuff I usually do with a client, the creative rationale, and then I read the commercial, and there's a long pause, and Mayor Jackson says, "Larry, I could have got anybody to write that. I wanted the guy who wrote Any Palladini's a pal of mine." But I didn't take that as rejection. I took that as, oh, fantastic. They're open for something. So I said, thank you very much. I'd like another crack at it. She said, by all means. So I go away. And in those days, I could only work at the radio station. I had a big Selectric typewriter, and I couldn't work at home. I needed to be in my space, my creative space. And so I worked nights, days, weekends, all the time when I was at the station. I could never work at home. So it happened to be a Sunday night in the summer. And I'm about 2 weeks into trying to figure out this new way. And I suddenly realize when I'm at my typewriter, I really don't know where Vaughan is. I've driven there twice and back, but I really, I got a mission. I don't know, I need to know where it is. So I get into the Chum newsroom, and Bob Summers there, who's those in Toronto will know him as maybe the best traffic reporter who ever lived in this city. He was working nights doing cottage country traffic. And I went up to Bob and I said, Bob, where's Vaughan? And Bob went over to the wall. I was educated by nuns, and we had one of these maps in our classroom. It took up a whole wall, and you pulled it down. It went right to almost the floor, and it was huge. It was the map of the city of Toronto. And Bob goes, there's the lake. There's Yonge and St. Clair where we are. There's Markham where you live. There's North York. And way up there, it's not even on the map, that's Vaughan. And as soon as he said that, I go, it's above Toronto. And as soon as, it's like the Any Paladinis and Palamine. As soon as I said it's above Toronto, it meant two things. It's a better city than Toronto. You know, you can promote it as a better city. And it's north of Toronto. It's above Toronto. So I knew I had that. So it's like when I had Any Paladini as a pal of mine, I knew I had that. And so when I had the city above Toronto, I knew I had that.
Vaughan has the McMichael Canadian Collection. Toronto has a midway and exhibition where dozens of skilled barkers hawk their wares, and you can ride a charming antique roller coaster for 3 weeks every year. Vaughan has Canada's Wonderland. Toronto has Canada's tallest buildings, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the harbour. Vaughan has the Courtright Centre for Conservation, Boyd Conservation Area, and Black Creek Pioneer Village. Toronto is a wonderful city. Vaughan is above it.
The city above Toronto, the city of Vaughan.
The phone rings in my office one day while the commercials are playing on all stations in Toronto. And can I speak to Larry MacInnis, please? Speaking. He said, Larry, this is Mel Lastman. Now, I knew Mel because he would come in on the morning show as a guest on our morning show when I was writing in that show. And he would come in to promote the North York Winter Carnival. His feet wouldn't touch the floor. You know,
now, Mel was at this point, he's the mayor of the city of North York, which eventually amalgamated with 6 other cities to become Toronto. I'm just saying this for people outside the Toronto area.
Yeah, and that's exactly. So he's eventually going to become the mayor of Toronto, but right now he's the mayor of North York and the longtime mayor of North York.
Yeah,
they loved him at North York, and I loved him.
Yeah.
So he says, Larry, he said, this is the phrase he used, I never forgot. Larry, I'm given to believe that you were the guy responsible for those City Above Toronto ads for City of Vaughan. I said, yes, Mayor, that's me. He said, Hazel is really mad. And he was talking about the late, great Hazel McCallion. He said, she was on CFRB the other day. Did you hear her? She was just ranting and raving about how dare they, which was, always flattering to know that that's getting her that kind of reaction. And I said, I didn't say any lies. I just, if she wants to advertise Mississauga, she can. And then he said, Larry, he said, I'm calling to correct the record. I said, okay, Mr. Mayor, what's that? He said, in your commercial, you say that Black Creek Pioneer Village is in Vaughan. I said, yes, it is. He said, it's in, part of it is in Vaughan and part of it is in North York. He said, Larry, let me tell you something. He said, the only part of Black Creek Pioneer Village that's in Vaughan is where the horses turn around to take a piss.
That sounds like Mel.
So, exactly.
Like Mel.
And so we both started to laugh. And then he said, Larry, would you like to write commercials for North York? I said, would I? He said, why don't we meet? So I met at his office, in his mayor's office in North York. And when we went in, he says, why don't we go downstairs? So his office is on 2 levels. And downstairs is like a children's playroom, literally like a children's playroom. There's toys, there's stuff, teddy bears, there's everything around. The furniture is very small. He said, you might meet here. He said, this is when my grandkids come over. This is where they spend time. I said, fantastic. So we met. And Mel was so great about kind of finding out. Before he wanted to talk about the commercials, he wanted to find out about me and how I worked and what I did and all that stuff. And we talked, and I got all this information about North York. And I called my writing partner at that time. He's still my writing partner, and a very, very, very dear friend of mine, Bernie DeBrookie. And Bernie and I wrote 3 commercials for North York. And the concept was that Mel was going to be sitting in his office getting calls from all over the world, and Mel was going to tell the most outrageous bald-faced lies about New York. One of the commercials was he gets a call from Switzerland. They said, we're interested in moving our business to North York. Do you have skiing there? He said, the highest mountains in Canada are at the corner of Yonge and Finch. He said, listen to this. And he opens the window and he yodels, and the echo comes back. So Mel loved that idea. Loved it. But when I went back to present it, the first thing Mel did was he asked me about my wife by name. He asked me about my 4 sons by name. Now, that always impressed me because either he took the time to write that stuff down when I left the first meeting, or he remembered it. Either way, that's a genius politician. And immediately he saw the benefit of that campaign. Unfortunately, wasn't like, it was in months later that the talk about North York amalgamating with Toronto happened, and those ads never ran. But the slogan was 1-800-GO-TO-MEL was the slogan. And
that's
it was
funny.
just going to, yeah, so that never happened. But Mel and I became great friends, and occasionally we would meet on the street because he lived not far from the Chum studio, which was at 1331 Yonge Street in those days. Occasionally I'd be going to Starbucks, and one time I'm walking towards Starbucks, and Mel and Marilyn, his wife, are coming down. They're holding hands. I always loved that too. And Mel stopped and he introduced me to Marilyn, and again asked about my wife by name. Like, it's a crazy savant kind of memory he had for those kind of details. So I love Mel, and he was. I always regretted that I never got to do any commercials with him.
Yeah, great stuff. Those are great stories. Larry MacInnis, along with Scott Feshik of Feshik Reed, are the creative people behind the Beer Canada campaign featuring the Mackenzie brothers. You have not heard it, you will hear it. Hopefully it'll make some kind of a difference. If not, at least it will have entertained millions and millions of Canadians for a number of weeks. Larry, thanks very much for dropping by. I appreciate chatting with you. It's always a pleasure.
Ted, I would be remiss if I didn't say that when I told my friend Roger Ashby that I was going to be doing this podcast with you, he said, say hi to Ted. I'm a big fan. We're all big fans of yours, Ted.
That's I don't know what to say. That's terrific praise coming from a legendary broadcaster, Mr. Ashby. Say hi to him for me.
I will, for sure.
All right, Larry, we'll talk soon. So once again, thanks for being with us. If it's your first time here, we appreciate it, and hope you come back, and hope you recommend our podcast to your friends. And don't forget, follow us. Also, don't forget, if you get a chance, go online, fill out your organ and tissue donation card. You could change or even save a life. Have a great week.
The Ted Wallisham Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And Helenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Helenda's, the way sausage should taste. The Ted Wallisham Podcast is produced by Joey Roselli. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. I'm Becky Coles. Submit your questions and comments to ted@twmedia.ca.